The White House is struggling to come up with a plausible explanation for the Russia bounty scandal. They're scrambling to put together a national response which is consistent to the coronavirus crisis, with cases surging out west and in Florida. And the Supreme Court ruled this week that not even the president is above the law when it comes to releasing his personal financial records and tax returns. All in all, I'm sure this is a week that the West Wing would prefer to forget. How will the recent flurry of activity surrounding the president impact the upcoming election in November? David Catanese is a national political correspondent from McClatchy, D.C. He joined me this week to provide the political pulse of America. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. David, if you're ready, we'll welcome you to the show, and we're excited to talk a little U.S. politics with you this morning. Thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, sure thing.
So, David, as you know, the White House has sort of struggled to come up with a plausible response to the Russia bounty scandal. So, I'm just wondering your thoughts on the matter and whether you think the president has suffered any additional damage and the damage it's done to the country as a whole.
Well, I think depending on how deep Congress decides to get into the issue, will sort of determine if he suffers more political damage. It's hard to keep up with the damage that Trump has sustained over the past, I would say, 30 to 60 days, especially. The coronavirus fallout continues. The second spike through the summer that's really going through the southern portion of the United States is one part of it. You've got an economy that's really struggling overall because of the coronavirus, and obviously you had the racial unrest. That was the most recent problem that confronted the White House. These stories kind of come up and they come up as blips. So the bounty story was sort of in the focus here in Washington for a week or so, and now it's kind of out of the headlines. So it's hard to assess exactly how much political damage that particular issue caused, but I think we know cumulatively it's been a pretty tough, rough month for the president.
Can I ask you, we saw that the Supreme Court issued rulings on Trump's tax returns and his other financial records, and they ruled that he wasn't above the law, despite the fact that he was the president, but they also did put restrictions on what Congress could see as well. So I'm
Right.
just wondering your thoughts on that whole situation as well.
So that was sort of a split decision for Trump, right? Because the court didn't say you've got to fork over your tax returns immediately. So the White House sort of claimed victory on that, saying, look, this is an invasion of privacy. What they did was kick it down to lower courts that said, look, the president isn't above the law. He should have to, if a court puts a pliable reason that they should see his tax returns, they should be able to. But this is going to take some time. So now we know that we're not going to see the president's tax returns in the next 4 months before the election, which it could be politically potent or explosive. But we may see them down the road into next year, whether or not he is president, and whether the Southern District Court of New York decides to go after the president if he's a private citizen, when he's not president anymore, if he is defeated in November, that will certainly be something to watch.
Now, when we look at what happened over the 4th of July weekend, there was certainly a spike in police-involved shootings and killings. I think there was like over 100 shootings alone in Chicago over the weekend. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering your thoughts on the time we're living in from a police perspective and how that relates politically as well.
Yeah, I think most activists who have been working on criminal justice reform for years believe that this is a pivotal moment, that they are starting to get buy-in from not only skeptical law and order Republicans, but from the broader public. I mean, look at how fast the polling on Black Lives Matter changed. Black Lives Matter was a polarizing slogan that Hillary Clinton couldn't even really fully embrace 4 years ago. And now it is popular across the board, one of the most popular political movements of our time, even more popular than standard political parties, Republican or Democrat. So you have lots of white folks that are maybe even more conservative that believe there needs to be criminal justice reform. So I think you see, it's just about different ways of doing it. So the Democrats had their legislation. They wanted to sort of put more aggressive reforms in place. The White House put out theirs. Democrats said it wasn't enough. So we're sort of at a stalemate again. But both sides believe that something needs to change, which means there's probably going to be momentum, if not in this Congress, certainly if Vice President Biden is elected. I think he will certainly prioritize that within the next year, even if the Trump administration and the Republican Senate can't get it through this year.
Now, we're living in a time where I've never seen before, where Congress, depending on what side of the aisle you're on, is sort of entrenched in their positions. And it seems like they're not willing to do a lot of compromising in Washington. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on the whole state of the legislative branch in America, and why do you think there's been such stalled progress in terms of the art of the compromise, so to speak?
I just think it's a greater partisanship that really started under Obama when, especially in his second term, he was meeting a railroad block with Mitch McConnell. There's little reward now for this bipartisan compromise. We did see on trade, the renegotiated NAFTA deal, that is something where there was a big bipartisan agreement on, because it was politically advantageous for Democrats and Republicans to say, we delivered this new thing. On issues of culture, though, on police reform, on race, very tough, polarizing issues, the parties play to their bases. And you've got a revved up liberal base that didn't get the candidate they wanted, and Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. So any type of compromise they see coming from Biden would seem to be, capitulation or bowing. And they don't want any of that from Trump. They feel like they're going to beat Trump and that they don't have to compromise with him. On the Republican side, though, if you begin to reach across the aisle to Democrats, you can get primaried and get beat in a Republican primary because you're not loyal to the conservative cause. So sort of the partisanization of our politics, where it's become more polarized on both sides, create disincentives for that kind of compromise building, because there's fewer people sort of in the middle that are persuadable. You're really talking to your base to try to get elected anymore, whether it be that, try to get that 40% and then add 5 or 6% to win an election.
Now, in terms of the congressional races outside of the presidential one in November, which one in sort of either Congress or the Senate will you be keeping an eye on as to how it'll play out in November in terms of affecting the way the next government sort of governs?
So I would point to Iowa, a state that President Trump carried by 10 points in the last election. There have been polls that now show that Iowa is a dead heat, that he is in a very competitive race with Joe Biden. There's also a Senate race there. Joni Ernst, he's a first-term Republican who was elected 6 years ago. She is facing a tough challenge and a little bit of an unexpected challenge from Teresa Greenfield, a Democratic candidate there. She's in a dead heat. So if Iowa has moved 10 points to the Democratic side, that's a huge swing because Iowa was seen as almost off the table, a safe Republican state. I would watch that state. If Joni Ernst is losing in Iowa, in November, that would mean there are other probably incumbents that are going down as well. And that means it's probably a big Democratic wave where they have won not only the Senate, but have picked up seats in the House and probably control all of government.
And we just switch back to the coronavirus for a second? You mentioned earlier the spike in cases both in Western and Southeastern states. I'm just wondering your thoughts on the lack of a national response or the lack of caring from the president and how the spike in that part of the country will affect us going into the fall.
The president has downplayed this from the beginning. We know that because he said it was going to wash away, that it would only be a few cases. We know that is demonstrably false now, given the numbers. Trump is so concerned about his own political fortunes and his own reelection that he sees any kernel of bad news that he has to stamp out, even if it means going against the facts that are right in front of our eyes. So there's also a Republican philosophy here that local control, that each state is different and that they should just determine their own outcomes. But with a pandemic, as we've seen, when you've got people still traveling, getting on airplanes, getting in cars, driving across borders to go to different states, to go to the beach or visit family, you need some type of national response. I think we're learning that. But right now, the Republican argument is it should be a state response because North Dakota is different than Florida. They don't have as many cases, so we can't impose from a federal stance what to do in some of these rural areas where it's not as bad as we should in Florida. The problem is, as long as we're allowing people to travel, and as long as we're allowing people, goods to move, services to move, people are still moving around this country. Not in the numbers they were, but they are. You're going to have this virus being transferred. And we saw these states that didn't have problems, a couple months ago now going through these spikes because people thought it was over. They sort of stepped back. They let their guard down. They weren't wearing their masks as much. They weren't washing their hands as much. They weren't doing social distancing as much. And here we are. So some of this does come down to personal responsibility and doing these small things. But we have found as a country, this is very hard. And that even small inconveniences are very hard to adapt to. And sometimes it's cultural. You saw states that rebounded pretty well. And now you're seeing states that are going through this that didn't take it as seriously. So it will be interesting to see if Vice President Biden, an incoming administration, if he imposes national standards. It will be controversial. You'll have some states in the Midwest, out west that say, hey, you can't tell us what to do. We're handling this. This is fine. But there is some political risk to that. So far, we've seen, I don't think there's any indication that Trump is going to do that right now. He's downplaying it and basically allowing governors and mayors to take their own local approaches. And right now, we're seeing that's not really working.
And in terms of the president himself, he continues to trail Vice President Biden in national polls. And I'm just wondering if you think it would be too late for the president to sort of reverse the trend it's going 4 months out into an election. You certainly know that polls can change, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on the whole trajectory of the Trump campaign moving forward.
So I don't think it's too late. I mean, 4 months is an eternity in politics. I would say if we were sitting 30 days from now, that's an eternity. Look at all what happened in the last month before 2016 with the Comey letter and the emails being revealed and the Access Hollywood tape that was revealed about Trump. I would expect these more surprises. 2020 has been a wild year, so I would not rule anything out. That being said, Trump is in a much worse position than he was. And people that say, oh, well, he was down against Hillary. Yes, but he wasn't down as far. I've looked at the numbers. He's down about double to what he was against Hillary Clinton at this point, sort of in beginning to middle of July of 2016. So he's also been there. I think part of the Trump allure last time was we got to try something new, a businessman, an outsider. We don't like Hillary. This guy's going to shake things up. He's going to drain the swamp. Now he's part of the swamp. And now he's dealing with a huge crisis, this pandemic, which Americans are seeing every day. Can you deal with this? And they're able to evaluate him as a president, as a commander in chief. And right now they're giving him failing grades. His approval on that is, in the 30s and 40s. That is not where he needs to be. So it's a completely different scenario. I think he's in a really tough rut. I think he needs an outside event to happen, something to happen to Joe Biden. Joe Biden makes a mistake. A national security crisis refocuses on, the commander in chief and incumbency. Outside of that, he's going to have a really rough time climbing back because the thoughts and feelings about Trump are pretty baked in, and it's going to be very hard for him to change minds.
And I'm just wondering if someone was to ask you about to assess the mental stability or competency of the president, what would you tell them? Because certainly it's come under fire with some of the decisions he's made. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on the whole mental capacity, ability of the president to hold the office he holds.
So I'm not a doctor, and I don't think it's actually responsible to evaluate any person's mental capacity, even if I were, unless I was, putting them through a test that they were under my supervision, and I was doing a personal evaluation of him. I'm obviously unable to do that. I don't think we're able to responsibly do that. What we can do is watch him each day. Everything the president does now is on video, on tape. We can rewind it. We can watch it again. And both of these candidates are in their 70s. So we are seeing, I think signs of decline with both of President Trump and frankly, Vice President Biden. They forget things, right? They garble their words sometimes. Their syntax is sometimes hard to understand. But I'm not going to say that, I don't think we are in the position, even as journalists, to say this person is, in cognitive decline versus that one. I think that has to come from a doctor. I think you can make just daily observations of how they're performing, how they answer questions. Are they following the actual question, or are they on a tangent about something else? How often are they forgetting simple things like names and places? I think that's a natural thing with aging, but this is the choices we have. These are who, voters have decided to put up. It's much rare that we have someone, in their 30s or 40s running for president. Even in Congress, Americans tend to elect older people. Maybe that will start to change with a new generation, but there are older voters are more likely to go to the polls, and that means they trust older people. So until that changes, these are going to be our choices. And it's frankly up to, I think, observations of voters to see who really has the capacity for this job day in and day out.
I'm just wondering, from a personal perspective, how would you assess the political culture we're living in if someone was to ask you to take off your journalism hat and just assess it as a regular citizen living in this time? What would you tell them?
I would say it's depressing, to be honest. The polarization is something that gets at me just because I have family and friends who are either on the one side or the other, and it's very hard to communicate the other side. And if you do sort of raise a opposing point of view, they get their back up, they get very defensive. It's harder and harder for people to have open minds because they feel if they're presented with new information that they are acknowledging they were wrong. And that's some of the hardest things to do, right, in life, is to say I was wrong about something. I had a really emphatic opinion about something, and wow, I was presented with this and I was wrong. That's what I'm supposed to do as a journalist, right? I'm constantly challenging the assumptions I have, trying to read more, trying to watch more. But if you watch cable news, you see diametrically different casts of stories on Fox versus MSNBC versus CNN. And if you're just watching one of those, you're not seeing the other. And I flip between the two or the three, and I see very different visions of America. Whether you care about, racial unrest, where an unarmed black man is killed in the streets, or you care about children who are African Americans that are being shot because of gun violence by other black men. One is on Fox News, one is on MSNBC. Rarely do we see both in the same show or the same story. And I think the only way to get over sort of the polarization is that people need to see those both sides and realize that there's a lot more gray than there is black and white on many issues.
Now, when we look at Joe Biden's decision coming up to pick a running man, I'm just wondering if you could sort of encapsulate where we are with that, and what do you think would be beneficial for him and the Democratic Party moving forward in terms of his vice presidential pick?
Yeah, so this is something I have done a lot of reporting on. Biden has said he's going to make a selection in early August. So we're thinking the first week of August. He won't put an exact date on it, but we're thinking this is going to happen within the next 3 to 4 weeks. We know he's going to pick a woman. The bigger question is, will it be a woman of color? He's getting a lot of pressure from outside groups to pick a black woman. We know 3 or 4 women are being seriously considered on that list, from Kamala Harris out of California, Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta, Val Demings, a congresswoman from Florida, even Karen Bass, a congresswoman from California, is sort of a late entrant into that race. Susan Rice, the former national security advisor, is also in the mix. The question is, does he go with an African-American woman, sort of trying to diversify the ticket and have a ticket that fully represents the Democratic Party, since African Americans are such an important part of the Democratic Party base? Or does he go with a more progressive person in Elizabeth Warren, who was obviously one of his challengers during the primary, has a lot of support within the Democratic base, within younger voters, somewhere Biden is weaker, but she is considerably to the left of him ideologically. So would he be comfortable with that pick? I think Warren is less likely than Kamala Harris. I think she's probably the front runner right now. But I think the fact that Biden has widened his search to these other women who have less experience, who are mayors or congresswomen, I think that shows that he's taken a wider look at this and that it's not necessarily Kamala. And I think the thing to remember about these vice presidential picks is Biden was through this himself, right? He was Obama's pick. So he knows the process. He knows how to do this. He's going to take his time. He's in no rush. Because the fact that he may only serve one term, this pick could be the next nominee for president and potential president and the first female president. So he is making a historic pick, not only for himself, but potentially for 2024.
And my final question for you has to do with what do you ultimately think will happen in the election? I know we're 4 months out from it, but what will you be watching to see unfold in terms of how the election may play out in the fall?
So the biggest question I think now on this election that makes it different than any other is we're in this COVID environment where every state is now changing their laws to accommodate for the coronavirus and not forcing people to go vote in person. So even though the election is November 3rd, a lot of the election will be taking place in October because states have changed their laws to allow people to vote early, to not need an excuse to vote via absentee. So you're going to see, I think September is actually going to be the new October, in that, October last year, 2016, we had all these events happening. It was hard to keep up with them. Everybody thought Hillary was going to win. But now, if those things occur, if we have an outside event in late October, a lot of these votes may have already been cast because people are not going to want to have to stand in line, put their public health at risk, especially older people. They're going to get their ballots sooner, and they're going to return them sooner in most of these battleground states. And most of the battleground states have early voting. They have absentee voting, and they've liberalized their laws to allow for it. So I would really watch September. That's going to be the most important, crucial month to see if Trump can make a run at a comeback here. He did it once before. Can he do it again? And does Biden make a mistake? And is there any intervening event? Does the economy somehow pick up? Is there a vaccine available to Americans that changes the sort of the political environment than it is right now? And right now it's very, very bleak for the president.
Hey, David, we want to take a few seconds to thank you for providing your insights and perspectives on several and a variety of political topics. We enjoyed your insight and perspective and want to thank you for your time this morning. Thanks so much for being here.
Sure thing. It was great to be with you. This was fun.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun too. Have a great weekend, and thanks again for the time, okay?
All right. Thanks, Kevin. See ya.